In the summer of 1863, as Confederate forces retreated through Georgia, the sisters of Greystone Abbey began hearing something that would haunt them forever. The sound of metal scraping against stone, echoing from beneath their chapel floor every night at precisely 2 in the morning. What they discovered beneath their sacred ground would expose a conspiracy so dark that it would shake the very foundations of their faith and reveal that their sanctuary had become a tomb for those who dared to resist. But before we uncover the horrifying truth hidden beneath Greystone Abbey, I want to ask you something. If you're ready to dive into one of the most disturbing stories of corruption and murder during the Civil War, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Also, let me know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. I love connecting with our international audience who shares our passion for these dark historical mysteries. Now, let's return to that fateful summer in Savannah, when Sister Margaret first realized that the sounds coming from beneath the chapel weren't the settling of old stones, but something far more sinister. According to the fragmentary records and testimonies that survived the chaos of war, what happened at Greystone Abbey during those final months of 1863 began as an act of faith, but descended into a nightmare that would claim the lives of innocent women who had devoted themselves to God. Greystone Abbey stood on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, like a fortress of faith against the encroaching darkness of war. Built in 1834 from local grey stone, quarried along the Savannah River, the convent housed 23 sisters of the Order of St. Benedict, women who had fled the growing violence throughout the South to find peace in prayer and service. The Abbey's Gothic architecture rose from the marshy Georgia landscape, like something transplanted from medieval Europe. Moss-draped oak trees surrounded the main building, their ancient branches casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard. The chapel, with its soaring spires and stained glass windows depicting scenes of martyrdom, sat at the heart of the complex, connected to the main convent by covered walkways that allowed the sisters to move between buildings even during Savannah's notorious summer thunderstorms. Sister Margaret O'Brien had arrived at Greystone Abbey in the spring of 1861, fleeing the violence that had erupted in her native Charleston after Fort Sumter. At 28, she was older than most novices, having spent her youth caring for her ailing mother before answering what she believed was God's call to religious life. Her practical nature and sharp intellect had quickly earned her the position of Abbey treasurer, making her responsible for managing the convent's finances and coordinating with the local community. The Abbey had always maintained a delicate relationship with Savannah's elite. Many of the city's wealthiest families had daughters or sisters within the convent walls, and their generous donations had kept the community comfortable even as war raged across Georgia. Father Matthew Greystone, the Abbey's superior and namesake, had arrived in 1859 with impeccable credentials from the Diocese of Charleston and a reputation for managing religious communities with both spiritual wisdom and financial acumen. Father Greystone was a man who commanded attention whenever he entered a room. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His sermons were eloquent, his prayers fervent, and his dedication to the Abbey's mission seemed absolute. The sisters respected him, the local community admired him, and the wealthy families who supported the convent trusted him completely with their most precious possessions, their daughters and their fortunes. By the summer of 1863, however, the war had changed everything. Sherman's forces were advancing through Georgia, and wealthy Confederate families throughout the region were desperate to protect their assets from Union seizure. Many had begun sending their valuables to Greystone Abbey for safekeeping, trusting that even Union forces would respect the sanctity of a religious institution. Gold, jewelry, family heirlooms, and even cash from prominent Savannah banks began arriving at the convent in increasing quantities, all entrusted to Father Greystone's care, with the understanding that these treasures would be returned when the war ended. The sisters had grown accustomed to the steady stream of visitors who came to deposit their valuables, and to the increasingly frequent private meetings Father Greystone held in his study with men who arrived under cover of darkness. Sister Margaret had noticed that these nocturnal visitors often spoke in hushed tones about ships, schedules, and routes to European ports, but she had assumed these conversations concerned the evacuation of refugees or the coordination of charitable aid. The first time Sister Margaret heard the sounds beneath the chapel, she thought she was dreaming. It was July 15th, 1863, and the oppressive Georgia heat had made sleep fitful for all the sisters. She had risen at 2 in the morning to seek the cool stone floors of the chapel for private prayer when she heard it. A rhythmic scraping sound, like metal against stone, coming from somewhere beneath her feet. She knelt on the cold marble floor, pressing her ear to the ground, and the sound became unmistakable. Someone was digging. The scraping was accompanied by the muffled thud of earth being moved and what sounded like whispered voices, though she couldn't make out any words through the thick stone. Sister Margaret remained motionless for nearly an hour, listening to the strange symphony of underground activity. The sounds seemed to move from one area of the chapel to another, as if following some predetermined pattern. When dawn finally broke and the sounds ceased, she found herself questioning whether the experience had been real or simply a product of exhaustion and stress. The next night, she deliberately positioned herself in the chapel at the same time. Again, at precisely 2 in the morning, the sounds began. This time, she was certain she could hear at least 3 distinct voices, all male, speaking in urgent whispers. The scraping sounds were accompanied by what seemed to be the movement of heavy objects being dragged across stone. By the third night, Sister Margaret realized she was not the only one who had noticed the disturbance. Sister Catherine, a young woman from Augusta whose family had fled south ahead of Union forces, approached her after morning prayers with dark circles under her eyes and a troubled expression. "Sister Margaret," she whispered as they walked through the cloister, "have you been having strange dreams? Dreams about voices under the chapel?" When Sister Margaret admitted that she too had heard the sounds, Sister Catherine's face went pale. "I thought I was losing my mind," she confessed. "But if you've heard it too, what do you think it could be?" The two women agreed to investigate together, but when they attempted to enter the chapel that night, they found the heavy oak doors locked from the inside. This had never happened before. The chapel was always open for the sisters' private devotions, day or night. When they tried the side entrance that led from the sacristy, they found that door locked as well. "Perhaps Father Greystone is conducting some special prayers," Sister Catherine suggested, but her voice betrayed her doubt. The following morning, Sister Margaret approached Father Greystone directly, asking if there had been any special services or maintenance work in the chapel that might explain the locked doors and strange sounds. His reaction was immediate and unsettling. His face flushed with anger, and he gripped her arm with surprising force. "Sister Margaret," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "the affairs of this abbey are not a matter for idle curiosity. You would do well to focus on your prayers and leave matters of administration to those qualified to handle them. I trust I won't need to remind you again about the importance of obedience." Father Greystone's harsh response only deepened Sister Margaret's suspicions, but it also made her realize the danger of pursuing the matter openly. She began to observe the abbey's routines more carefully, noting patterns she had previously ignored. She discovered that Father Greystone disappeared from his quarters every night at approximately 1:30 a.m., returning just before dawn. She noticed that certain areas of the convent grounds showed signs of recent excavation, though these areas were always carefully concealed by the following morning. Most disturbing of all, she began to realize that some of the sisters who had shown curiosity about the strange sounds were being assigned to increasingly isolated duties that kept them away from the main buildings. Sister Catherine had been reassigned to tend the abbey's small infirmary, which was located in a separate building on the far edge of the property. Sister Anna, who had also complained of sleepless nights, was now spending her days in the abbey's gardens, working alone and forbidden from entering the main buildings, except for meals and formal prayers. The pattern became clear when Sister Margaret overheard a conversation between Father Greystone and Brother Thomas, a lay brother who had arrived at the abbey shortly after the priest. They were standing in the courtyard outside her window, speaking in low voices, but the still summer air carried their words clearly. "The O'Brien woman is becoming a problem," Father Greystone was saying. "She asks too many questions, and she's beginning to influence the others. Perhaps it's time for her to receive a special assignment as well," Brother Thomas replied. "The infirmary could use additional help, or perhaps she might benefit from a period of contemplative isolation." "Not yet," Father Greystone said. "She handles the abbey's finances, and her sudden removal might raise questions from our benefactors in the city. But keep watching her. If she becomes too persistent in her inquiries, we may need to take more direct action." The casual way they discussed her fate sent a chill through Sister Margaret's heart, but it also crystallized her determination to uncover the truth. She realized that whatever was happening at Greystone Abbey went far beyond simple maintenance or even irregular religious practices. The combination of secrecy, intimidation, and the deliberate isolation of curious sisters suggested something far more sinister. That night, instead of attempting to enter the locked chapel, Sister Margaret positioned herself in the bell tower, which offered a clear view of the entire abbey complex. From this vantage point, she could observe without being seen, and what she witnessed confirmed her worst fears. At exactly 1:45 a.m., Sister Margaret watched as Father Greystone emerged from his quarters, but he was not alone. Brother Thomas accompanied him, along with two other men she didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who clearly were not members of any religious order. The four men moved quietly across the courtyard toward the chapel, carrying what appeared to be tools and lanterns. They unlocked the chapel doors and disappeared inside, but Sister Margaret could see the faint glow of their lanterns moving about within the sacred space. After about 20 minutes, the strange procession emerged again, but this time they were carrying something heavy between them, a wooden crate that required all four men to lift. She watched as they carried the crate to a small outbuilding behind the main convent, a structure she had always assumed was used for storage. But instead of entering the building, they seemed to disappear behind it entirely. The lantern light vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Sister Margaret remained in the bell tower until dawn, but the men did not reappear. When she finally crept down from her hiding place, she found the chapel doors unlocked and everything appearing normal, as if the nighttime activities had never occurred. Over the following weeks, Sister Margaret began to piece together a more complete picture of the conspiracy. She noticed that the mysterious nighttime visitors always arrived on the same nights that wealthy families from Savannah came to deposit their valuables for safekeeping. She observed that Father Greystone's private study contained detailed maps of the Georgia coast and shipping schedules for vessels bound for European ports. Most significantly, she began to realize that the sisters who had been reassigned to isolated duties were not simply being punished for their curiosity. They were being systematically removed from any position where they might observe or interfere with the nighttime operations. Sister Catherine, during one of their brief encounters at morning prayers, managed to whisper an urgent message. "They're making us dig, Sister Margaret. They say it's for storm cellars, but the tunnels go much deeper than that. And some of the sisters who refused to help, they've disappeared entirely." The revelation that the sisters were being forced to participate in whatever was happening beneath the abbey filled Sister Margaret with horror and determination. She realized that her position as treasurer might be the key to understanding the full scope of Father Greystone's operations, and she began to examine the abbey's financial records with new scrutiny. What she discovered in the ledgers was stunning in its scope and brazenness. The valuables being deposited for safekeeping were being systematically recorded at far below their actual worth, with the difference being transferred to accounts she had never seen before. Gold coins were being recorded as silver, precious jewelry was being listed as costume pieces, and family heirlooms worth thousands of dollars were being documented as having minimal value. But even more disturbing were the shipping records she found hidden in Father Greystone's private files. Crates of religious artifacts and charitable donations were being regularly shipped from Savannah to banks in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. The shipping dates corresponded exactly with the nights she had observed the mysterious activities around the chapel. Father Greystone and his conspirators were not simply safeguarding Confederate wealth, they were systematically stealing it, replacing valuable items with worthless substitutes, and shipping the originals to European banks where they could be converted to cash and deposited in private accounts. The scope of the theft was breathtaking. Sister Margaret estimated that over the past 2 years, valuables worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had passed through Greystone Abbey, with the vast majority being stolen and shipped overseas. The families who had entrusted their most precious possessions to the Abbey's protection were unknowingly funding their own betrayal. But the financial records also revealed something even more sinister. Several entries in the ledgers made reference to disposal costs and excavation expenses, with payments being made to individuals Sister Margaret didn't recognize. The amounts were significant, and they seemed to increase whenever one of the sisters was reassigned or disappeared entirely. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more horrifying than Sister Margaret had imagined. The sisters who discovered too much or refused to participate in the digging operations weren't simply being isolated, they were being murdered and buried in the very tunnels they had been forced to excavate. As this realization settled over her, Sister Margaret heard footsteps in the corridor outside Father Greystone's study. She quickly replaced the ledgers and slipped behind a heavy curtain just as the door opened and Father Greystone entered with Brother Thomas and one of the mysterious men she had seen before. "The O'Brien woman has been in here," Father Greystone said immediately, his voice tight with anger. "I can smell her perfume, and the papers aren't exactly as I left them." "How much do you think she knows?" Brother Thomas asked. "Too much," the priest replied, "and she's too intelligent to be easily fooled or intimidated. I think it's time for Sister Margaret to join her friends in the tunnels beneath the chapel." Hidden behind the curtain, Sister Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she listened to the 3 men plan her murder with the same casual efficiency they might use to discuss the weather. They spoke of timing, methods, and disposal as if they were planning a business transaction rather than taking a human life. "We'll need to be careful," Father Greystone continued. "She's well known in the community, and her sudden disappearance might raise questions. Perhaps an accident during one of her nighttime prayer sessions. A fall down the chapel stairs, perhaps, or a tragic encounter with one of the wild animals that roam the grounds. Or we could simply say she's been called away to tend to a sick relative," suggested Brother Thomas. "We've used that explanation before, and it's never been questioned." Me, the third man, who spoke with a rough accent that suggested he was not from Georgia, had a more direct suggestion. "Why complicate things? Take her to the tunnels tonight. Put her to work like the others, and when she tries to resist or escape, she meets the same fate as the rest, simple and clean." And as the men continued their planning, Sister Margaret realized that her discovery of their conspiracy had sealed her fate. But she also understood that she might be the only person in a position to expose their crimes and potentially save the remaining sisters who were still alive. When the men finally left the study, Sister Margaret waited several minutes before emerging from her hiding place. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. She had perhaps hours before they came for her, and she intended to use that time to gather evidence that could bring these monsters to justice. She quickly collected the most damning financial records, the shipping documents, and a detailed map that showed the tunnel system beneath the abbey. The map was annotated with locations marked as disposal sites and storage areas, creating a horrifying blueprint of the underground network where stolen treasures were hidden and murdered sisters were buried. But as she prepared to leave the study, Sister Margaret heard voices approaching down the corridor. Father Greystone was returning, and this time his voice carried the finality of a man ready to take action. "Find her now," he was saying. "We've waited too long already. Brother Thomas, check her quarters. Samuel, search the common areas. I'll take the chapel. If she's gathering evidence, that's where she'll try to hide it." Sister Margaret's heart raced as she realized she was trapped. The study had only one entrance, and Father Greystone's voice was getting closer. In desperation, she looked toward the window, which opened onto a small ledge that ran along the second floor of the building. It was a dangerous escape route, but it was her only option. She carefully opened the window and stepped onto the narrow ledge, clutching the stolen documents against her chest. The Georgia summer night was thick with humidity and the sound of insects, but she forced herself to move slowly and quietly along the ledge toward the corner of the building where she could climb down a drainage pipe. Behind her, she heard Father Greystone enter his study and immediately begin cursing as he discovered the missing documents. "She's been here!" he shouted. "She's taken the records. Find her. She can't have gone far." Sister Margaret reached the drainage pipe and began her descent, but the metal was slick with condensation and rust. Halfway down, her foot slipped, and she barely managed to catch herself, the documents scattering into the darkness below. She could hear men running through the Abbey grounds, their voices getting closer as they searched for her. She dropped the final few feet to the ground and desperately gathered the scattered papers in the darkness. Most were still readable, but she knew she had limited time before her pursuers found her. She needed to reach the town of Savannah and find someone in authority who would listen to her story and take action to save the remaining sisters. But as she prepared to run toward the main road, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The distinctive scraping and digging noises coming from beneath the chapel, but now accompanied by what sounded like human voices crying for help. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Some of the sisters were still alive in the tunnels, being forced to continue digging even as their captors planned to murder them. She couldn't abandon them to save herself. Instead of fleeing to town, Sister Margaret made her way to the small outbuilding where she had seen the men disappear with their stolen treasures. Behind the structure, she found what she was looking for: a concealed entrance to the tunnel system, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The entrance led to a crude stairway carved into the earth, descending into darkness beneath the Abbey grounds. Sister Margaret could hear voices echoing from the depths, and she recognized several of them as sisters who had supposedly been reassigned or who had disappeared entirely. She descended into the tunnels, following the sound of voices toward what she hoped would be a confrontation that could end the nightmare at Greystone Abbey. The underground passages were more extensive than she had imagined, with multiple chambers carved out of the clay soil and supported by wooden beams. Some chambers contained crates of stolen valuables, others showed evidence of recent excavation, and several contained items that Sister Margaret preferred not to examine too closely. In the largest chamber, directly beneath the chapel, she found them. 6 sisters who were supposed to be dead or reassigned, forced to work as slave laborers in the underground network. They were thin, exhausted, and terrified, but they were alive. Among them was Sister Catherine, who looked up with amazement and hope when she saw Sister Margaret approaching. "Sister Margaret," she whispered, "how did you find us? They told us you had been killed." "Not yet," Sister Margaret replied grimly, "but we need to get out of here immediately. I know what they're doing and I have evidence that can stop them, but only if we can reach the authorities in Savannah." But even as she spoke, she heard footsteps in the tunnel behind her. Father Greystone's voice echoed through the underground chambers, no longer maintaining any pretense of religious authority. "Sister Margaret," he called. I know you're down here. Come out now, and perhaps we can reach an understanding that will allow you to live." The confrontation that followed would determine not only Sister Margaret's fate, but the fate of every person who had entrusted their valuables and their daughters to the supposed sanctuary of Greystone Abbey. What happened in those tunnels beneath the chapel remains a testament to the courage of women who refused to allow evil to triumph, even when that evil wore the robes of religious authority. The evidence Sister Margaret gathered that night would eventually expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single corrupt priest, revealing a network of theft and murder that had operated under the cover of wartime chaos and religious respectability. The untold stories of Greystone Abbey remind us that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who use our deepest beliefs and most sacred institutions as cover for their crimes. The chapel that was meant to be a place of prayer and sanctuary had indeed become a tomb, but not in the way its builders had ever intended. If you found this story as disturbing as I did while researching it, please share it with others who appreciate these dark chapters of history. Give this video a like if you want to see more investigations into historical mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories. What do you think really happened in those final moments beneath Greystone Abbey? Leave your theories in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, remember that the darkest secrets are often hidden in the most sacred places.